"I'm stuck! I can't budge an inch!" Oscar's desperate cries echoed through the cavern as his friends frantically searched, their lights slicing the darkness. 40 feet down a narrow tunnel, they found him, wedged so tightly that his chest barely rose with shallow breaths. His shoulders strained against the stone, arms pinned uselessly at his sides. Oscar Hackett Neil Moss, a British man, met a tragic fate in Peak Cavern, a cave in the Peak District. These were the horrifying final moments of his life, trapped in an infamous cave system he would never leave alive. There's no shortage of horrifying stories of people becoming trapped in underground caves. You probably are even familiar with some of the more infamous ones, like the story of Floyd Collins, a passionate Kentucky caver. In 1917, he became stuck in a tight passage after dislodging a 27-pound rock that pinned his ankle. A massive 17-day rescue effort followed, but tragically, Floyd succumbed to hypothermia 3 days before rescuers could reach him. His story remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of caving. Or there's the harrowing Cave Creek disaster from back in 1995. In New Zealand, a group of 17 students plunged into a chasm when a platform they stepped on collapsed under their weight. Tragically, only 3 survived and were airlifted to safety by helicopter. Heading underground is not something to take lightly. Proper equipment, preparation, and experience or guidance from a qualified expert are essential for safe cave exploration. It takes very little, a single misstep or an uncharted tunnel or shifting rocks, for an underground adventure to end in tragedy. Among the many cautionary tales, few illustrate the real dangers of caving as clearly as the story of Oscar Hackett Neil Moss, known simply as the Neil Moss Incident. This year was 1959. Oscar Hackett Neil Moss, known to his close friends and family as just Neil, was an undergraduate studying philosophy at Balliol College in Oxford. Even at only 20 years old, Neil was an enthusiastic sportsman, in stark contrast with his father, who was a cotton executive. But Neil's love of sport and excitement grew into an eagerness for exploration. Despite his young age, Neil Moss was a budding amateur explorer, leading him to join the British Speleological Association. This group of like-minded enthusiasts shared their passion for caving, also known as spelunking, a term often used to describe cave exploration as a hobbyist activity. Neil's membership with the British Speleological Association wouldn't just introduce him to similar like-minded explorers, it also put him on the inevitable path toward Peak Cavern, a famous cave system within the Peak District. This area, located in a vast region of central England, often referred to as the Midlands, is famous for its stunning landscapes, especially the rolling hills and moorlands. These dramatic features set it apart not only from urban areas, but also from many other rural regions of the UK. Within part of the Peak District is a prominent chain of mountains known as the Pennines. This mountain range stretches southward and is often referred to as resembling a backbone or a spine that runs through the Midlands. At the southern end of the Pennines is Peak Cavern, renowned for its natural beauty. It also boasts a history of human habitation that spans several centuries. In early 1959, members of the spelunking group Neil Moss belonged to learned about an intriguing discovery recently made within Peak Cavern itself. Several members of the British Speleological Association learned of an exciting discovery within Peak Cavern, a chamber filled with stalagmites, aptly named Stalagmite Chamber. This previously unexplored part of the cave system could be accessed through an entrance overlooking the village of Castleton in Derbyshire, England. 8 members of the association decided to plan an expedition and witness this exciting new discovery for themselves. Just 2 weeks after the discovery of Stalagmite Chamber on March 22, 1959, the group of amateur cavers arrived, eager to explore the newly found section of Peak Cavern. Among them was Neil Moss, filled with excitement for the journey ahead. But unknown to Neil and his friends, this fateful descent into the famous Derbyshire cave would tragically become his final adventure. All 8 members of the group were experienced potholers, a more colloquial British term for spelunking. Backed by the sponsorship of the British Speleological Association, the group embarked on their exploration of the newly discovered underground passage, aiming to reach Stalagmite Chamber. Entering Peak Cavern, Neil Moss and his small party of fellow cavers ventured into the extensive labyrinth of passages that lie beyond the show cave, the area of Peak Cavern able to be viewed and explored safely. The group were set on descending into the large, newly discovered chamber that sat nearly a mile from daylight. Their journey began with a series of challenging scrambles, requiring them to wriggle their way through a narrow, mud-floored tunnel. This tight passage was the only route leading to the more open and expansive chamber. In some sections, the ceiling was a mere 10 inches above their heads, forcing a claustrophobic crawl. Progressing just inches at a time, The amateur cavers took nearly 2 hours to navigate approximately 600 feet of the narrow tunnel. After a grueling 2-hour journey, most of it spent crawling on their stomachs or on their hands and knees when space allowed, the 8-man expedition finally emerged. The narrow entry tunnel abruptly widened, revealing a fairly large chamber. Located approximately 1,000 feet beneath the surface, they had reached the fabled stalagmite chamber. The stalagmite chamber itself sloped upward, with the cave floor inclining toward the far end. About 400 feet from the group's entry point into the chamber was a fissure, leading to a shaft that descended into the inclined floor. This placed it roughly 1,000 feet below the surface. The shaft had been previously identified by the cavers who discovered Stalagmite Chamber. They observed that the narrow shaft led to a near vertical passage about 40 feet deep. They also noted a corkscrew twist a few feet down, where the shaft abruptly spiraled in multiple directions. This feature would likely make it challenging for anyone attempting to navigate the descent, requiring not climbing but careful crawling through the tight and twisting confines. Such a task would be difficult since the shaft only measured about 2.5 feet by 1.5 feet wide. While exploring the chamber and climbing the incline to examine the stalagmites overhead, the group came across the narrow shaft leading downward. It remains unclear whether they had planned to investigate this feature or if they were even aware that this tight passage was situated about 1,000 feet underground. It's possible the British Speleological Association may have shared information about the shaft, assuming they had been informed of its existence during the initial survey of Stalagmite Chamber. Regardless, it was quickly decided amongst the 8-man group that Neil Moss would be the first of them to head into the narrow vertical passage. While Moss was seemingly amongst the largest in the group, standing around 6 feet tall, he was also seemingly slim enough to fit through the opening. Excited, the young student willingly led the way, squeezing down into the vertical passageway, perhaps hoping to discover a new series of passages beneath the shaft. Perhaps Neil set out to make history as the first person to ever make it all the way down this narrow shaft and into whatever lay below. Neil Moss certainly would be remembered, but for a far more devastating reason. After a few moments of making his descent, Neil's caving companions heard his voice. An alarmed cry yelled up at them, "I say, I'm stuck. I can't budge an inch." The exact details of how this incident unfolded remain unconfirmed, but caving experts widely believe that during his descent, Neil Moss encountered a boulder obstructing the spiraling passage. As the 20-year-old attempted to move the large rock out of his way, he may have made a critical error. The repositioned boulder ended up blocking the passage, making it impossible to pass ropes or ladders down to Neil, which meant that the rest of the group had no way of getting him back up. In their frantic efforts, the other cavers managed to lower a length of cable down to Neil. Once he secured it around himself, his 7 companions began to pull. However, they quickly encountered a new problem. Either Neil was too heavy for the group to lift, or the passage was too narrow to allow him to be safely extracted. His shoulders could have been broad enough to become wedged between the rocky walls of the shaft. But while Neil's fellow cave explorers kept up their efforts to free him, the ropes they were using kept continuously snapping, unable to get their trapped friend to budge. It seemed to be the same thing that prevented the group from pulling Neil out was the same reason he was unable to climb back up out of the narrow shaft by himself. His body had become wedged inside the narrow passageway, making his situation even more dire. It's believed that in his struggle to free himself, he inadvertently shifted into a position that further complicated efforts to extract him, leaving rescuers with an almost insurmountable challenge. Some have attributed Neil's predicament to the fact that he had descended just below the corkscrew section of the passage. To navigate the twist, he likely had to contort his body, which caused him to become wedged tightly between the walls of the shaft. This narrow space, believed to be only about 18 inches wide, left him effectively sandwiched, making any attempts to free him exceedingly difficult. But as if being wedged deep underground wasn't bad enough, somehow the worst part of Neil's ordeal was still yet to come. Thanks to his being jammed inside a narrow passage, any airflow coming into the vertical shaft was now blocked. You might think this would have made it hard to breathe, but what was far worse was that Neil could breathe, and his own breathing was proving to be as dangerous to him as being trapped. When humans inhale air through the mouth and the nose into the lungs, we don't breathe out just oxygen, but we also expel carbon dioxide. The human respiratory system, working with the cardiovascular system, is designed to absorb oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. Air naturally contains small amounts of carbon dioxide, but in our bodies, excess carbon dioxide is diffused into the alveoli of the lungs. This excess carbon dioxide then exits our body when we exhale, and Neil was doing a lot of breathing in and breathing out. With Neil's body blocking airflow into the passage, every exhalation filled the already limited pocket of air with increasing amounts of carbon dioxide. Since carbon dioxide is colorless and odorless, it's difficult to detect when it begins to saturate the surrounding atmosphere. Elevated carbon dioxide levels in the confined spaces can severely impact human health, causing symptoms such as headaches, fatigue, shortness of breath, and nausea. In extreme cases, prolonged exposure can lead to loss of consciousness, asphyxiation, and death, especially in a confined space. Like an underground shaft with no airflow, Neil was rapidly polluting the tight space around him with increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide poisoning begins when the air a person breathes contains 5% or more carbon dioxide by volume. Trapped in the shaft, Neil faced a dwindling oxygen supply while repeatedly inhaling the carbon dioxide he exhaled, leading to escalating disorientation. His condition worsened quickly, and it wasn't long before he lost consciousness. Above, the 7 other potholers still desperately trying to free Neil were also succumbing to the effects of carbon dioxide poisoning. Common symptoms such as headaches, dizziness, fatigue, chest pain, and confusion began to set in. The confined, poorly ventilated space compounded the danger, and the toxic air eventually caused 3 members of the group to lose consciousness while they awaited the arrival of the rescue team. But they had been lucky. If someone inhaling too much carbon dioxide isn't able to immediately access fresh air, they can suffocate. Fortunately, help wasn't far away. A mountain rescue unit from the Royal Air Force arrived at Peak Cavern, soon joined by additional assistance from the National Coal Board and personnel from the submarine base at Gosport, a nearby town. As the situation unfolded, a call for further support was broadcast over the radio, which saw a huge response of courageous and skilled local caving experts turning out to try to help Neil. Well over 200 other potholers arrived from nearby towns, along with rescue workers and countless local villagers who got involved with the rescue effort. It's said that one man, a clerk whose boss refused to give him time off to go and help with the rescue, actually quit his job to be part of the effort. Local hospitals sent oxygen cylinders to allow the wedged caver to breathe clearly, while others worked on trying to get him free. The rescuers struggled their way through the same mud and dark that the 8 caving companions had ventured into earlier that day. Navigating the narrow, muddy tunnels, they eventually emerged into the stalagmite chamber, where they were met with a waist-high pool of water. From there, they immediately began devising strategies to free Neil from the tight passage. Around 50 volunteers were spaced out at intervals in the tunnel, forming a hand chain that they used to pass along ropes, food, lamps, and oxygen cylinders. An oxygen mask was lowered down to Neil, but there wasn't enough room in the narrow shaft for him to fit it over his face and breathe. And things were getting all the more serious as the air within the passage was full of carbon dioxide. Hours of struggling passed, and despite the dire situation, Neil reportedly joked with the men trying to save him, perhaps as a way to calm his own nerves. However, his condition continued to deteriorate. Neil alternated between moments of lucidity and episodes of confusion as the effects of carbon dioxide poisoning took hold once more. After 4 hours, Neil became delirious and slipped into unconsciousness. Over the next 2 days, a number of experienced cavers arrived on the scene to assist with the effort to rescue Neil. Many of these experts were small enough to fit inside the narrow tunnel that he was wedged in, one of them being a veteran caver, Bob Leakey. Leakey was small enough in stature to fit into the tunnel, at least in theory. However, despite his repeated attempts, he was unable to reach Neil. The overwhelming levels of carbon dioxide in the air forced him to retreat. Through the various attempts, a Royal Air Force medical officer, Flight Lieutenant John Carter, was keeping Neil Moss alive. Though the caver was unconscious, Carter kept pumping oxygen down a tube into the narrow shaft where Neil was trapped. In total, 8 people were lowered, one after another, down the passageway to where Neil was. Of these, though, only 3 of the rescuers actually reached Neil, and each of them experienced blackouts thanks to the levels of carbon dioxide in the air. The carbon dioxide levels posed a significant danger not only to Neil, but also to his rescuers. Multiple attempts were made to descend the shaft using oxygen canisters and masks provided by hospitals. Rescuers found it impossible to make a head-first descent while keeping the oxygen mask securely in place. It would become dislodged or stuck during the descent. It was at this point that a new volunteer came forward, Ron Peters, a 25-year-old man who worked as a printer in Derby. Standing just 5 feet tall, Ron offered to attempt the rescue despite having limited caving experience, and got closer than any of the other attempts so far had. He was able to reach Neil, who was still unconscious. Ron was even able to touch the trapped student's shoulder, but just at that moment, Ron began gasping for air, needing to be pulled back up fast. But he wasn't done yet. After being given enough oxygen to revive him, Ron was insistent on having another attempt at saving Neil. He had been close enough to tap his shoulder. If he could just make it down that far into the passage a second time, there was a chance he could do something to help get the wedged caver out. So he went back in again. During this attempt, Ron was able to tie a hemp rope around Neil's chest and signaled to the other volunteer rescuers above. They gave a strong tug on the rope, pulling it taut and causing Neil to move only 18 inches upward. However, the moment was short-lived. Neil became stuck fast in the passage once again, and his breathing suddenly stopped altogether. Rescuers realized the rope they were using to try to pull him out was compressing his chest too tightly. In a desperate bid to save him, they slackened the rope, which allowed him to start breathing again. Another man, John Larson, made an hour-and-a-half-long effort to try to budge Neil's right arm to allow rescuers to pull him all the way out, but he too was unsuccessful, thanks to the carbon dioxide levels making him feel lightheaded. The rescuers were fighting to free the trapped student from his underground prison, but the rocky grip of the passage walls refused to yield. Hope for Neil's survival was beginning to fade rapidly, and volunteers started trying to use crowbars and hammers to chip away at the fissure to widen the shaft. Air purification equipment was brought into the cave to try to offset the effects of the carbon dioxide in the air, but the canister was too large and cumbersome to get into the narrow shaft. Several hooks on ropes were lowered into the passage and inserted into Neil's clothing. With these, they managed to lift him another foot upward, but their progress was once again halted as Neil's unconscious body became stuck, likely due to the corkscrew twist in the narrow passage. By this point, 32 hours had passed since Neil and his caving companions had entered Peak Cavern and he'd gotten stuck. The rescuers could tell Neil was only getting weaker, and the longer it took to free him, the faster he was likely to succumb to carbon dioxide poisoning. A desperate radio broadcast had been sent out for an expert potholer, someone who was less than 5 feet tall and who weighed under 112 pounds. They needed to be exceptionally athletic and have unlimited courage. At 2 o'clock in the morning of Tuesday, the 24th of March, 1959, someone answered that call. June Bailey, who was only 18 at the time, appeared at Peak Cavern wearing a red helmet and red sweater. She was instructed to head down into the narrow passage and then to break both of Neil Moss's collarbones. It sounds painful, but it was thought that this would help narrow the width of his shoulders, possibly creating a tiny bit of extra space, enough to free him from the shaft. But it was already too late. As Flight Lieutenant Carter described it, it was a horrid moment. There was no sound as I hung my head down the shaft, and I knew he was gone at last. At the entrance of the tunnel into the stalagmite chamber, Eric Moss, Neil's cotton executive father, had been on site ever since hearing the news his son was trapped. He told the rescuers, "I don't want anyone else to risk their lives by trying to get my son's body out. Let's leave him where he is." Despite such a huge push to rescue him, 20-year-old Neil Moss could not be saved. Once the final attempt to save him from Peak Cavern failed, a Royal Air Force doctor on the scene was forced to declare at 3 a.m. on the 24th of March, 1959, Neil was dead. This came despite the fact that medics and rescuers weren't able to actually see his body. It was presumed that he never regained consciousness after he started feeling the effects of the carbon dioxide poisoning. Stuck, not only unable to move, he would have slowly lost his ability to stay awake and lucid, before eventually dying. Eric Moss, Neil's father, was devastated. This outcome, losing his son, had been his worst nightmare. He'd been holding vigil near the entrance to Peak Cavern for 2 whole days, anticipating any news about his young son's fate. But despite 48 hours spent diligently waiting, he eventually had to give up any hope of ever seeing Neil again, dead or alive. The entrance to the narrow vertical shaft where Neil ended up trapped was soon sealed using loose rocks gathered from around stalagmite chamber. Once it was covered, an inscription was later placed nearby, in dedication to Neil Moss. The entire section of Peak Cavern where he lost his life was also renamed in his honor, now referred to as Moss Chamber. Bob Leakey, having been part of the attempts to rescue Neil Moss from Peak Cavern, became a vocal critic of how the rescue effort was handled, particularly the decision to leave Neil's body in the narrow shaft where he died. Leakey gathered extensive evidence, including newspaper articles about the tragedy and the full coroner's report on Neil's death. He also reached out directly to others involved in the rescue, seeking their accounts to piece together a clearer picture of the events. Using all of this, he wrote a long, scathing article that levied criticism at the Derbyshire Cave Rescue Organization and how they handled the Neil Moss incident. While Leakey's critique was rejected by the Derbyshire Cave Rescue Organization, it's thought that it and the death of Neil led to significant reorganization of the DCRO. Despite its tragic outcome, the rescue attempt is widely remembered by the caving community not only for its heartbreaking conclusion, but also as a pivotal lesson in the importance of safety and preparation to prevent future accidents. The incident serves as a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in caving and the critical need for proper planning, equipment, and expertise when exploring underground passages. Neil Moss's tragic story still raises tough questions. Could anything have been done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out I Was Trapped Underwater for 3 Days, or click on this video instead.